Our next speaker is Jannette Barth, and Jannette Barth is an economist with I didn't ask you about this pronunciation. Pepacton? Okay. Institute LLC, a research and consulting organization. Since 1974, Dr. Barth has been estimating regional and local economic impacts in the United States and the United Kingdom. As an example of her work, Dr. Barth was retained to estimate economic impacts of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Former positions include Chief Economist, New York Metropolitan Transportation Authority, and consultant Chase Econometrics Interactive Data Corporation. Dr. Barth has lectured and written extensively on the economic impacts of shale gas development, including a recent peer-reviewed article in the journal New Solutions. Please welcome Dr. Jannette Barth.
Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me tonight. And thank you all for coming. Is this a good loudness? Great. I've been writing, speaking, testifying, lecturing for about 4 years now on the economic impact of shale gas development. We keep hearing a lot of bad news about shale gas development, including, for example, drinking water contamination, poisonous air emissions, radon in Marcellus shale gas, and even something about earthquakes. But despite all this bad news, many people keep claiming that the economic impacts will be positive and enormous. The truth is that it is unlikely that the net economic impact will be positive for the Marcellus region or even for New York State. The gas industry has a lot of money to spend on political contributions, lobbying, advertising, PR, and even economic impact studies. And they have funded a number of economic impact studies. The media picks up on these studies and reports the positive claims. Even some of the folks who are opposed to gas drilling drank the Kool-Aid, and they'll say things like this: although it will help our economy, shale gas drilling is a bad idea due to environmental and health impacts. The fact is that the economic impact studies that are funded by the gas industry have reached vastly different conclusions than unbiased, independent economic research. Independent and peer-reviewed research and experience with gas drilling elsewhere show that regions with gas drilling tend to be economically worse off in the long run. They suffer a long-term bust. Many of the workers that take the short-term gas-related jobs in places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia are transient workers from out of state, and they send most of their income back home to be sent in their home states like Oklahoma and Texas, not in the Marcellus Shale region. One of the studies not funded by the industry concludes counties that have focused on energy development are underperforming economically compared to peer counties that have little or no energy development. And a peer-reviewed article concludes, the areas of the United States having the highest levels of long-term poverty tend to be found in the very places that were once the site of thriving extractive industries. And another study concludes that there is clear evidence that resource-dependent counties in the United States exhibit more anemic economic growth. Headwaters Economics, a research firm out west, not funded by the gas industry, concluded that counties that were not focused on fossil fuel extraction as an economic development strategy had higher growth rates, more diverse economies, better educated populations, a smaller gap between high and low-income households, and more retirement and investment income. And more recent research that looked at the short-term impacts concluded that there were only modest increases in employment and income during the short-term boom, and that the negative economic consequences during the bust exceed the positive economic impact during the boom. And please be aware that communities with the actual wells are not the only communities that will be negatively impacted. Nearby communities, rural and urban alike, will be impacted by activities that are related to gas drilling, activities such as transmission lines, gas storage facilities, compressor stations, frack sand facilities, man camps, staging areas, and truck traffic and related accidents. It's quite likely that the negative economic consequences of such activities will outweigh any positive economic consequences. There are many serious concerns, particularly for New York State. For example, some of the important industries vital to upstate New York will likely decline due to industrialization of the landscape and the real or perceived risk of water, air, and land contamination. Such industries include agriculture, organic farming, tourism, hunting, fishing, outdoor recreation. Some time ago, I personally looked at data for New York State. New York State has had conventional vertical gas drilling for a long time. So I looked at the top 10 gas-producing counties in New York State for the period from 2006 to 2008. The gas-intensive counties were not better off than neighboring counties without gas drilling when you look at the number of families below poverty level, median household income, or unemployment rates. And a bit more recently, I looked at data for the 4 most gas-intensive counties in the Barnett Shale in Texas. Again, similar conclusions. The gas-intensive counties in the Barnett Shale are not doing better than the rest of the state in unemployment rates, household income, or the number of people in poverty. I don't have a slide on West Virginia, but it was recently reported in West Virginia that the so-called game-changing gas boom has not materialized there. In 4 years of shale gas drilling, only 916 jobs were created in West Virginia, and the severance tax that was expected to produce tens of millions of dollars in new revenue has not grown at all. The unemployment rate in the 4 core drilling counties has risen since drilling began. Let's look at some of the employment estimates made by industry-funded researchers and compare them to unbiased data. An early estimate of job creation by industry was that 88,000 Marcellus-related jobs were created in Pennsylvania in 2010. Publicly available data showed that only 65,000 jobs were created statewide in all industries in Pennsylvania in 2010, and half of those were in education and health and in leisure and hospitality. Later, the industry claimed that 48,000 jobs were created in 1 year in Pennsylvania. At least they came down from their 88,000 number. But the Keystone Research Center, not funded by the industry, found that in 3 years, less than 6,000 net new jobs were created in Marcellus core and ancillary industries. Less than 6,000 net new jobs in 3 years. And in Ohio, an industry-funded study claimed that 200,000 jobs will be created over the next few years. An independent study, not funded by the industry, estimated that there will only be 20,000 jobs created, 1/10 of industry's estimate. Perhaps of greatest concern is the statement that President Obama has repeatedly made that 600,000 jobs will be created by shale gas development in the United States. This number is also from an industry-funded study. And that study is flawed. I wrote a critique on that study, and if you're interested, later I'll tell you how to find a copy of that. The reality is the oil and gas industry is a highly capital-intensive industry. It's 10 times more capital-intensive than the average American industry. This means that vastly more money is spent on equipment than on training and employing workers, who typically follow the rigs from state to state. Thus, oil and gas development is not an effective strategy for creating jobs. Let me turn to the economic assessment in DEC's revised draft SGEIS. It is woefully inadequate. It is inaccurate, it is misleading, and it is unacceptable. It is very similar to the industry-funded studies. Both the industry-funded studies and our own DEC report ignore significant economic costs and exaggerate benefits, including employment, tax revenue, and income. The DEC's assessment did not properly address a major concern that I mentioned earlier and has been voiced repeatedly over the past several years: the likelihood that various existing industries that are vital to the region may be severely and negatively impacted. The assessment report itself states that agriculture and tourism are important industries in the Marcellus region, and yet the potential costs associated with declines in these industries are not estimated. We have a preliminary analysis of dairy farming in Pennsylvania. A report by the Penn State Cooperative Extension concluded that counties with higher drilling activity have larger average decreases in the number of dairy cows, and declines in milk production are higher in counties with gas drilling. I think it's truly too early to draw informed conclusions about the dairy industry in Pennsylvania, but early evidence is showing that dairy farming is suffering due to shale gas development. We don't know if farmers are leaving the dairy industry voluntarily, and we don't yet know if gas drilling in rural Pennsylvania is affecting consumer perception of the quality of agricultural products, including milk. In a few minutes, you'll hear Sandra talk about health impacts. As a result of many potential negative health impacts, there will very likely be substantial health costs, and the DEC has made no attempt to estimate such costs. There have been many concerns voiced over the past several years about the cost to communities, but there was no attempt to estimate these costs. Costs associated with the increased demand for community social services, police and fire departments, first responders, and local hospitals should be estimated, not simply mentioned and then ignored. Regarding another economic cost to communities, Jill Morrison of the Powder River Basin Resource Council in Wyoming reported there have been 10% to 15% increases in crime rates in the counties in Wyoming where there have been gas booms. She also said that they have terrible drug problems, particularly with methamphetamines, coming into the counties with gas booms. These counties have had to increase the size of their jails. These would be significant costs to upstate New York communities. Additional costs to communities have become apparent in Pennsylvania as well, and economic justice has become a concern. Dr. Bonita Kolb of Lycoming College did a study funded by the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency. She concluded that while the effects are broad-based and include some positive impacts on housing, the negative impacts are most severely felt by those who live on the economic fringe: the working poor, seniors, the disabled, and the non-working poor. By 2012, almost 5,000 wells had been drilled in Pennsylvania. A study out of Penn State Cooperative Extension showed that only one of the 50 wealthiest school districts in Pennsylvania had a single Marcellus well by the middle of 2010. And it found that school districts with drilling, on average, experienced declines in total local revenues. The same study found that districts with more drilling activity, on average, lost a somewhat larger percentage of students than did districts with less activity or no drilling. The study speculates that the negative association between enrollment size and drilling activity may be due to the exodus out of the district of lower income and renting households who are leaving because they can't afford the higher rents and costs of living in those communities. Those communities have higher rents and higher costs of living because of the influx of transient workers arriving without their families, sending much of their money back home. This is all further evidence that many of the workers are indeed temporary, from out of state, and they're not paying local taxes or spending much locally. Road costs can be huge and must be planned for in advance to avoid problems experienced elsewhere. It's possible to estimate potential truck traffic and the related wear and tear on roads, and these costs are not all paid for by the gas industry. A confidential New York State Department of Transportation memorandum was leaked prior to the release of the DEC's economic assessment. The DOT memo provided estimates of truck traffic and costs associated with shale gas development in New York, but the DEC ignored all of those costs in their report. You may find it interesting that in Arkansas, it looks like the state taxpayers are getting stuck paying for over $400 million worth of damage to state highways after the gas industry damaged the roads. That's just state highways. That doesn't count the damage to county and local roads. And it's been reported in Texas that it will cost $2 billion to repair roads destroyed by the fracking industry there. Of course, both Texas and Arkansas have a severance tax, and the taxpayers are still getting stuck paying for road damage. What will happen in New York State, where we don't even have a severance tax, and our Department of Environmental Conservation has ignored all road costs in their economic assessment? And by the way, when thinking about the costs of roads and other costs to both our state and local taxpayers, think about a study done by a Penn State professor who concluded that in Pennsylvania, most local governments being affected by shale gas development are not seeing more tax revenue as a result, while 26% of the local governments indicated that shale-related costs to them have increased. Another paper out of Penn State in March of last year showed that the impact of Marcellus activity on the total amount of personal income tax dollars collected by the state appeared relatively small. Also, the survival rate of locally owned businesses in Marcellus counties was slightly poorer than of locally owned businesses outside of the Marcellus region. This may be evidence of crowding out, which is typical of boom-bust economies. It is well known that the extractive industries create a boom and bust cycle for communities. But the costs of a long-term bust are not incorporated into the DEC's assessment. The DEC report summarized some research findings on the potential impact on property values, but there was no mention of the reports that some banks are refusing to issue mortgages on properties with or near a gas well. There was no mention of the experience in Texas, where the Wise County Central Real Estate Appraisal Board has devalued homes by as much as 75% if a gas well sits on the property. Property values are a very important issue and should be investigated in depth. Remember that a decline in property values results in a decline in property revenues as well, property tax revenues. At least one major insurance company has stated, and I quote, "It is unwilling to insure against the unique risks associated with fracking." And research by Duke University and Resources for the Future demonstrates that the risk of groundwater contamination from natural gas extraction leads to a large and significant reduction in house prices. So if one cannot get a residential mortgage due to industrial activity on the property, or if one cannot get homeowners insurance, or if drinking water becomes contaminated, home values and consequently property tax revenue in the region may plummet. Another important economic cost to the region that is completely ignored in the economic assessment is the loss of future economic development potential after a vast network of pipelines is built, ruling out future building on or adjacent to these pipelines after the gas industry and its short-term jobs leave the area in a few years. This may be a significant cost to the region going forward. Supporters of shale gas development claim that the ad valorem tax will result in generous tax revenue to localities. There are many uncertainties regarding the ad valorem tax as it applies to shale gas development. When one considers the potential costs that may be incurred by local communities, it is far from clear that the ad valorem tax will be sufficient to pay the increased community costs, the increased public health costs, and mitigation of the environmental impacts. It is clear that the ad valorem tax will not cover costs to communities early in the drilling process, as the tax starts to be collected several years after the start of production. There will be substantial costs to communities prior to the collection of the ad valorem tax, and small upstate communities do not have excess cash to cover such costs. It is uncertain whether the discount rates used to calculate the tax are appropriate in the high-risk case of horizontal high-volume slickwater hydraulic fracturing. The gas industry is not required to take into account the very real and very significant risks and costs to the public. We know that in 2009, local governments in New York State received, on average, approximately $600 in tax revenue from each producing oil and gas well. The costs to communities that will result from horizontal high-volume slickwater hydraulic fracturing are likely to far exceed this. So far, I have focused on the many costs that have been ignored by the DEC. I'm now going to turn to benefits. Benefits, including employment growth, income growth, population growth, and tax revenue, have all been exaggerated. All of these factors are dependent on assumptions made regarding natural gas production. If production assumptions are exaggerated, then employment, income, population, and tax revenue growth will also be exaggerated. It appears that the assumptions regarding both the amount of recoverable shale gas and production amounts are exaggerated. The assumptions on recoverable gas that were used in the DEC's report were provided by the Energy Information Administration, the EIA. Just before their report was released, the USGS issued revised estimates of recoverable gas. The more recent USGS estimate of technically recoverable gas is far lower than the EIA numbers, and the EIA publicly stated that it would defer to the USGS numbers. Well, the DEC used the higher estimate. Any accurate economic assessment should use the most available and most accurate estimates on recoverable assets. The DEC report also states that each newly constructed well is assumed to have an average productive life of 30 years. Other researchers have shown that the productive life of a shale gas well is far shorter than 30 years, closer to between 4 and 7.5 years. So remember, if exaggerated assumptions go into an economic model, then exaggerated projections of employment, income, and tax revenue come out. In the economic modeling world, we say garbage in, garbage out. There are more problems with the DEC study, but I know I'm running out of time to list them all, but I will mention one technical problem. They use RIMS to multipliers. RIMS is RIMS. It's the Regional Input-Output Modeling System of the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. Input-output modeling is very useful in many situations, and I have used it for some clients. But in this instance, it is lacking for a number of reasons. First off, it does not capture the cost of environmental degradation, damage and wear and tear on roads, health effects and pollution, and negative impacts on other industries such as agriculture and tourism. Input-output models assume that all populations have identical spending patterns in the region. This exaggerates economic impact if new workers are transient, sending their wages back home, not being spent in our region. There are several other technical reasons why input-output modeling is insufficient in this case, and I'll give you my email on my very last slide. If you're interested in those, I'll be happy to share them with you. So we're all wondering, if shale gas development won't help our economy, then what will? What can we do about our high unemployment rates? This is a major concern for all of us, and right here in Chemung County, the unemployment rate jumped to 10.5% in January. Some have speculated that this jump is due in part to the fact that drilling has slowed in Pennsylvania and workers who were crossing the border are now unemployed. You should be aware, though, that unemployment rates in the gas drilling counties in Pennsylvania have also increased. Shale gas development is not a long-term sustainable industry on which to build a future for Elmira or Chemung County or even for New York State. Shale gas development is likely to make our communities worse off. As Tony explained, and we did in our paper with a bunch of other authors, renewable energy is the logical way to go for many reasons. And job creation is one of them. Job creation from investment in renewable forms of energy appears to be much greater than job creation from investment in fossil fuels. Estimates out of the University of Massachusetts Department of Economic and Policy Research show that the number of jobs created for every $1 million of expenditures on producing oil and natural gas is only 3.7 jobs, while close to 10 jobs are created for every $1 million spent on producing wind and solar energy. The plan that was recently published in the journal Energy Policy to move New York State completely off of fossil fuels and onto renewables in the form of wind, water, and solar by 2030 would result in positive economic benefits for New York State and for this region. New York State can and should move to renewables ASAP. The jobs that will be created under this plan will require a wide range of skills and education levels. We are lucky in New York State to have many colleges and universities where innovation and research takes place. More of that can be channeled toward renewables. We also have many bright people with entrepreneurial skills. We have many experienced workers who can work with their hands. There will be jobs created in urban and rural areas. There will be jobs for engineers and scientists. There will be jobs for contractors, builders, and general home repair workers for installation work, and jobs for many others in retrofitting homes and buildings for energy conservation. And all of these jobs created in New York for New Yorkers will have indirect and induced multiplier impacts, creating more jobs in other industries that provide supplies and services to these workers and their families and to the renewable energy industry itself. And the expansion of renewables will not impair other industries that are vital to upstate New York. Agriculture, organic farming, winemaking, tourism, hunting, fishing, and outdoor recreation can easily coexist and continue to grow with the development of renewable energy in the form of wind, water, and solar. The renewable energy sector is sustainable and long-term. Many of our currently unemployed New Yorkers wanting to work in New York State would be able to get jobs if our leaders would encourage a statewide shift to renewables, and our communities would not incur the significant costs associated with shale gas development. At both the state and federal levels, we need the political will to make changes that will incentivize private investment in renewables, with greater regulatory and financial support for investment in wind, water, and solar energy technologies. Our leaders would create many jobs, protect our environment, protect existing businesses and industries that are incompatible with an industrial landscape, keep more of our people healthy, and improve national security. Energy would be produced at home. Here's my email. Here's a web address that provides many of my writings on this subject, not all of them, but many. So please feel free to contact me, and thank you for listening.